Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we really try to unpack some of the more complex stuff out there.
hmm
And today we are going deep on the Continuous Net Settlement System,
Yes, we are.
or CNS as it's often called.
Yeah,
For all of you financial pros listening, this one's for you.
absolutely.
We're going to see how this system might actually be the hidden engine behind GameStop's crazy stock price.
Yeah, we're really talking about the nuts and bolts, the plumbing of the stock market here.
Right.
This is the stuff that most people don't even realize exists, but, it can have a huge impact on how stocks are traded and how they're priced.
Oh, yeah.
And when it comes to GameStop, well, CNS is particularly interesting.
Yeah, so just to quickly recap, for anyone just tuning in,
Okay.
CNS is basically meant to streamline those stock trades.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that the buyers get their shares, the sellers get their money, quick and efficient.
Yeah.
It's like a giant clearinghouse.
Exactly. Yeah, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, or DTCC, they're the ones overseeing it all.
Right.
And they've got a subsidiary in the National Securities Clearing Corporation, or NSCC.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones that actually run this CNS system. And, the main goal is to minimize risks in the market.
Right.
But, and this is where it gets interesting, especially with GameStop.
Okay.
There's some evidence that suggests that this system might have a couple of vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited.
Oh, and one of the big concerns that we keep seeing, particularly from Dr. Jim DaCosta's letters to the SEC, is this thing called the obligation warehouse.
Yes.
Can you break that down for us? What exactly is this warehouse, and why does it matter in all of this?
So think of it this way. The obligation warehouse, it's basically a holding pen for trades that haven't settled yet.
Okay.
These are called FTDs, failures to deliver.
Right.
Now, it's supposed to be there, for legitimate delays, but some people are worried that it's actually being used to hide real short positions.
Okay.
So instead of actually having to borrow and deliver shares when you're short selling GameStop, say, this obligation warehouse lets these positions stay hidden.
Oh, wow.
And that could mess with the real short interest in the stock.
Okay, so potentially there's a lot of IOUs for GameStop shares just kind of floating around out there,
Potentially, yeah.
which, if you think back to the short squeeze, helps explain maybe how we got over 140% of GameStop shares supposedly sold short.
Right.
I mean, it's more shares than actually exist.
Yeah, it's more than the float.
And DaCosta, he was pretty vocal about this in his letters, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He had some serious concerns about the lack of transparency.
Mhm.
He even used the term pseudo-shares
Wow.
to describe these unsettled obligations. It really raises the question about whether these short sellers are actually being held accountable
Right.
for actually finding and delivering the shares that they're selling.
Okay, so this is where things get kind of technical, but stay with us, folks.
Yeah.
There's this process called share lending, which seems to be at the heart of all this. So how does this all work, and how does it connect back to this obligation warehouse and GameStop's price?
Okay, so share lending, it's actually pretty common practice. Institutions, like hedge funds,
Right.
they borrow shares from other people so that they can sell them on the market, hoping to buy them back later at a lower price, to profit from the difference.
Right, the classic.
Exactly, classic short selling. But what's worrying is that those borrowed shares can be relent and then relent again.
Oh, wow.
And you can end up in a situation where you have more shares being traded than actually exist.
Oh, wow.
And it's possible that this obligation warehouse, by holding all these unsettled trades, these pseudo shares,
Right.
that it's actually making this overlending easier, especially for stocks that are heavily shorted like GameStop.
Okay, so it's like this house of cards.
Kind of, yeah.
But what happens when someone actually wants to take possession of their GameStop shares? Like if they wanted to transfer them to another broker? We're looking at some Reddit posts and people were saying that their brokers couldn't actually locate the shares for these kinds of transfers.
Right, that's a really good point. These AC-CATS transfers where you're moving your shares between brokers, that can really expose the cracks in the system.
Interesting.
If a broker can't find the actual shares to transfer, it might mean that they've been relying on that obligation warehouse
Okay.
to hold a placeholder, that pseudo share instead of having the real thing.
Right. And in some of these Reddit posts we saw, people were theorizing that this could be a sign of naked short selling, where shares are sold without ever actually being borrowed in the first place.
It's definitely possible, but we do have to remember that these are just theories.
Right.
Based on, individual stories, and proving naked short selling is really tough.
Okay, so we've got this potential disconnect
Yeah.
between the number of shares being traded and the number that actually exist.
Potentially, yeah.
Especially with GameStop. And the obligation warehouse could be helping to hide all of this.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated,
Oh, no.
there's this thing in the CNS system called offer to consent.
Ah, yes, the offer to consent. From what I understand, it's a way to basically just delay settlement indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
So those FTDs, those failures to deliver, they can just hang out in the obligation warehouse for even longer. Is that right?
That's right. And while it might have some legitimate uses,
Sure.
the worry is that it could be used to just keep hiding those FTDs and make things even less transparent.
Okay.
It's like kicking the can down the road.
Right.
And when we're talking about a stock like GameStop, which has been a target for so much short selling, it just adds another layer of complexity to everything.
Yeah, so we're starting to see this picture emerge where the CNS system, which was designed to make things efficient, might actually be creating opportunities for manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with GameStop, where the short interest has been so high.
Exactly. And understanding these little details, these
Yeah.
intricacies, is so important, especially for anyone who's involved in the financial markets,
Yeah.
whether you're an investor or a professional. Because if the system itself is allowing for this manipulation,
Right.
it really raises questions about how fair the market is and how accurate the information is that we're all using to make decisions.
Right.
To make those informed decisions.
Absolutely. It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of Wall Street, right?
Yeah.
Seeing how everything works.
Yeah.
And realizing that maybe some of those gears are a little rusty,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to GameStop.
And what makes it even trickier is that this CNS system, even with all these potential problems, it's actually incredibly efficient.
Right.
I mean, it processes trillions of dollars worth of transactions every single day.
Crazy.
And most of the time, it works perfectly fine.
So how do we square that, that efficiency with the potential for manipulation? It seems kind of contradictory.
It is. It really highlights why we need more transparency and more oversight. But the problem is that the system is so complex that it's hard to keep track of these things even for the regulators.
And this is where we get to something really interesting that's been gaining a lot of attention in the GameStop community.
Mm-hmm.
This direct registration system, or DRS.
Yes.
It's basically a way for investors to bypass the whole traditional brokerage system
Right.
and register their shares directly with the company's transfer agent.
Exactly. So DRS takes those shares completely out of the DTCC's hands, which means they can't be lent out.
Right.
And they can't get caught up in all the mess of the CNS system.
So it's like taking your GameStop shares off the game board completely.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And from what we've seen in the Reddit posts, a lot of investors are seeing this as a way to force transparency and maybe even trigger a squeeze by lowering the number of shares available for lending and short selling.
That's the idea. It's fascinating to see how investors are taking control.
Yeah.
They want more control over their own assets. Right. It really shows the power of information and how much people want a more transparent and accountable market.
But even with DRS, there's still so much speculation and uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when it comes to those specific timelines and theories about how all this is going to play out.
Right.
I mean, we've got T plus 35, T plus 6.
Yeah, all these cryptic predictions.
Exactly. So many theories floating around out there. It's hard to know what to believe.
It is, and it's important to approach all those theories with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right.
Because they might sound really interesting.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time they're based on incomplete information or interpretations of how the market works that might not be totally accurate.
So how do we separate the signal from the noise? It feels like we're drowning in information here.
It comes down to critical thinking.
Okay.
And doing your own research.
Right.
Don't just believe everything you hear, even if it sounds convincing.
Yeah.
Check your sources. Look for analysis that's based on evidence, and be careful of explanations or predictions that are overly simplistic.
It's like being a detective, right?
Yeah.
Trying to put all the pieces together and figure out this complex puzzle.
Exactly.
And speaking of clues, we found some discussions on Reddit about a 2024 SEC filing.
Oh, right.
That seems to make the settlement procedures even more confusing, especially for options contracts.
Yeah, that filing has sparked a lot of debate.
I bet.
Some people think it's an attempt to hide the system even more,
Right.
while others see it as a necessary update,
Okay.
to keep up with how the market is changing.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
But no matter how you look at it, it just shows how much investors are worried about this lack of transparency.
Exactly. It all comes back to this fundamental question.
Yeah.
In a system that's meant to be so efficient, is there really enough transparency
Right.
to make sure the markets are fair and orderly, you know? That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question for sure. And it goes way beyond just GameStop.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
This CNS system, it's the foundation of the entire U.S. stock market.
It's huge.
And any problems with it, any lack of transparency could have huge consequences.
So where do we go from here? What can investors do, especially those who are interested in GameStop? How do they navigate all of this?
Well, the most important thing is to stay informed. The more you understand about this CNS system,
Right.
the better decisions you'll be able to make.
Makes sense?
Keep learning.
Yeah.
Keep asking questions, and don't be afraid to challenge the way things are usually done.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, we've seen how some investors are taking things into their own hands with DRS,
Right.
taking their GameStop shares out of the traditional system.
Yeah, DRS is one way to potentially have more control over your investments, but you have to weigh the good and the bad. It's not a perfect solution, and it might not be right for everyone.
But it definitely shows how much people want more transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. That's what we should all be pushing for. A market where the rules are clear, everyone's on a level playing field, and investors can trust that the system is working the way it's supposed to.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the CNS system and how it all connects back to GameStop. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here, but it's a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the real mechanics of the market.
It's a journey, not a destination, you know?
Right.
And it's so important to keep learning, especially in a field like finance where things are always changing.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, everyone, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a fairer and more transparent market for all.